So to understand the terms of trade rationale for trade policy, you first need to think about a world in which there's no tariffs. So we're first thinking about a world with no tariffs, and then we're going to see what happens when we impose tariffs and how that leads to this terms of trade rationale for trade policy.
Sorry.
Yes?
Did you assume about cost transportation?
Pardon me?
Cost transportation.
Transportation costs. Okay, so we have not assumed anything about transportation costs so far. We will add transportation costs in a subsequent model. For now, transportation costs, what that would potentially do to this, so we have not, this assumes that trade is perfectly free. So that's why the domestic price is exactly equal to the world price. But this is somewhat immaterial for now. When we add transportation costs, you'll see how it affects things. Okay. Any other questions on this picture? Lower price. And producers, of course, are feeling a little bit pinched because they're getting a price that's lower than the domestic equilibrium price. Okay, so from here, the next thing we want to think about is taxes, right? So we want to add now the taxes, trade taxes into this. So we're going to assume that the government applies an ad valorem import tax, and ad valorem just means it's a percentage, right? That's most common today. The alternative is having a specific tax. But we're going to use an ad valorem tax. So we're going to denote tau as 1 plus the tariff rate on good I, but good I is just going to be good 1 for now. And clearly tau is strictly bigger than 1. We're talking about a tax. If it's strictly less than 1, then that's an import subsidy. For the rest of this talk, we're not really going to talk about import subsidies. We're going to focus on import taxes. So the key thing about taxes is that they now drive a wedge between domestic prices and international prices. So previously we had this equivalence between domestic price P1 and the international price P1 star. Now tau, as long as tau is not 1, these two things are different. And that's what's going to help. That's what's going to drive this terms of trade rationale or trade policy. So now we have a similar picture to what we had before. This is the home market for good 1. The black line is where prices were before. Imposing a trade tariff is that import demand falls. So I'm actually going to use this. Yes?
When you say large quantity, is it in terms of population or in terms of ethnic?
That's a very good question. So when I say large country, it could be a tiny country like Jamaica, as long as the imports, the imports have an impact on world market prices. So that's what we mean by large country. So when we say large country, notice here that imports go from this black line here to this blue line here. So that means that world import demand falls. That's what large country means in this context. So it's not about population. So I'm gonna actually draw this here. Hopefully you can see it. And I'm gonna do it a little bit more step by step. Okay, so this is home market. This is world market. This is our demand curve, supply curve. This is our import demand curve, and this is our export supply curve. Now, assuming that there are only 2 countries in the world, imports are going to be given by the imports from the home country. So if this is the world market price here, then imports have to be the difference between what the country supplies and what the country demands. So this gap here is imports. See that? Okay, so now the question is, what happens when a tariff is imposed. When a tariff is imposed, now we think about that retailer who wants to purchase goods, right, from the world market. Tariff is all of a sudden imposed. That retailer is thinking, well, you know what, I'm actually not going to purchase so much because now that's more expensive for me. So import demand immediately falls. That's the first thing. So import demand goes from there to some new import demand here. Call it M prime. Import demand falls. And as import demand falls, well, what happens to world prices? What happens to world prices? Up or down? Down, exactly. So this was our world price before. I'm going to call it P star. And now world prices fall to P star prime. But in the domestic market, the price that consumers face is not P star prime. The price consumers face is P star prime plus the tariff. So now that price is going to end up above the original domestic price. So now we have P star times tau. P star prime, rather, times tau. And that is above the old price, world price. Did not get the memo about Thank you. Okay, so this is exactly how we get this picture over here, right? Import demand falls. Imports are going to shrink, as you'll see. So now that we were here with imports before, and now that the domestic price is higher, imports shrink to this line here. So this is M prime. Okay? And you can also see the same effect on this graph. Imports go from this level to this level here. Imports shrink. Okay? So you impose a tariff. World demand falls for imports. World prices fall. Domestic prices go up. Imports shrink. Okay? But now we have another thing that we want to talk about, which is the impact on tariff revenue, which we haven't mentioned before. So I'm going to restart my little picture here, because I like to do this on a board. So let's go back to our home market. Supply curve, demand curve. Gotta make sure there's enough space. It takes like 10 years to figure out how to draw these pictures correctly. Yeah. All right, and now we got the world market. We've got import demand and export supply. Okay. So, as I mentioned before, here's our world price before the tariff. Okay, P star. And here's our level of imports before the tariff. Okay. Now, what is tariff revenue? Well, it's got to be zero, right? There are no tariffs, right? So tariff revenue here is zero. So now we're going to impose the tariff. World imports fall. World prices fall. Da-da-da. Domestic prices go up. Da-da-da. Now, imports are in here. This block here is imports. Now we can look at this picture and say, what is tariff revenue? Tariff revenue is actually this lovely rectangle right here. Can everyone see that? This rectangle is our tariff revenue. Why? Because that's the level of imports times the value of the tariff. Okay? So now we can think about welfare in this new picture, right? Previously we had consumer surplus that was all the way down here. Now our consumer surplus has shrunk. Why is consumer surplus shrunk? Exactly, increasing prices. So here's our consumer surplus now. What about producer surplus? Has that gone upward? It has increased. Who's saying this? I can't see. Oh, yay, thank you. Exactly. Producer surplus has gone up. Very good. And what about revenue? Well, there was none before, and now we have some. What's that? Yes. So now we have some revenue. Blah, blah, blah. So we can think about the net effect of this change. So we have government revenue. I'm not going to go into. And here's our government payoffs. It's consumer surplus plus producer surplus plus our revenue. And we just said consumer surplus went up. Producer surplus, oh, I'm sorry, went down. You guys have to correct me when I say nonsense, okay? You get gold star if you correct me when I say nonsense. All right, producer surplus went up. Tariff revenue went up. Okay, so is the government better off or worse off with the tariff? Who says better? Hands up if you say better. Hands up if you say worse. Hands up if it depends. Good. That's the right answer. It depends, right? Because we've got loss in consumer surplus, gain in producer surplus, and gain in tariff revenue. So this all depends. All right, so let's break it down. What about this gain in tariff revenue? So I'm actually going to kind of jump to the answer, right? So that we can get on more fun stuff. So our optimal tariff turns out to be this very simple expression, which is 1 over the import elasticity of demand, right? The foreign import elasticity, export supply elasticity, sorry. Now, why? Well, what does it have to do with anything? What we noted here is that the immediate effect of an imposition of tariffs was the change in import demand. That can only happen with a large country. If the country is small, this change doesn't happen. It's negligible. World markets don't care. So if the change in import demand is small, then the optimal tariff has to be 0 because there's no terms of trade effect. So the terms of trade effect is what we kind of highlighted here. This is the rectangle. This is the terms of trade effect. So on net, what we get out of a tariff is this positive terms of trade effect here. And we get these other dead weight loss triangles here. One is a consumption distortion. The other is a production distortion. And these two are negative effects. But we get this positive effect here, the terms of trade effect. And if this terms of trade effect is 0, then we have no incentive to impose a positive tariff. Okay, so this kind of looks crazy here, but the whole point of this exercise was to say, thinking only about economic rationale, is there any incentive to impose a tariff? The answer is yes, for a large country, and it comes from this terms of trade effect. If it's a small country, this terms of trade effect is 0, so there's no economic rationale for a tariff. But then you say, wait a second, lots of small countries have tariffs, so why do they have tariffs? That's when we get into the politics of it, okay? And that's where we're going next. Any questions about this? Okay, so now I want to talk about lobbying and trade policy. Because as we just saw, for small countries, and by the way, I'm gonna keep this here. And I'm gonna do one more little picture that I think will be useful for you. When we're talking about this optimal tariff thing, if we wanted to plot this government welfare function as a function of the tariff, it would look a little like this. Starting at 0, as we just said, there's always this positive gain. So for a small tariff, the government can gain. This is for a large country now. Let's not confuse things. There's a gain, but for tariffs that are too large, it starts to go down. And then at some point, there's a prohibitive tariff where people simply stop importing. And if people stop importing, then there's no more effect of the tariff. But what this picture tells us is that there is some optimal tariff. Right? If this is a large country, and that optimal tariff is positive, and it's 1 over the export supply elasticity, or import demand elasticity. Okay? Okay, so that's another picture I want you to keep in your head. But that's just terms of trade, and that's just economics. And in the real world, we know there's a lot more than economics. These governments are not necessarily welfare maximizing. They're political animals, right? And they care about their constituencies. So we want to incorporate lobbying into this model. So we're going to think about the most famous model of lobbying and trade policy, which is Grossman and Hellman 1994. So Grossman and Hellman 1994 said, okay, look, we think this is not just about economics. It's not just about the terms of trade rationale for trade policy. We know that there's lobbying. How can we incorporate this into our model? So they do this with what's called a common agency framework. And so we're going to talk about this model with the common agency framework. So as before, we're going to have two countries, home and foreign. We're going to assume that they have similar economic and political systems. But their tastes, endowments, and political conditions, i.e. lobbying conditions, might be different. So the government preferences, once again, we're going to have producer surplus, government revenue, but now we're adding lobbying contributions. And lobbying contributions, I like to talk about this with my US students because they say lobbying, and I say, yeah, lobbying, or bribery, whatever you want to call it. You know, different words in different countries. You know, take them out for dinner, fly them on a private jet, etc., right? We could call it lobbying, we could call it bribery, whatever you want to call it. Some influence that has some sort of monetary payoff. And since we're going to have these two countries, we're going to see eventually how the lobbying interacts with the two countries. So lobbying. We're going to assume that some individuals are organized and some are not. And the organized individuals are the factor owners, right? So these are the guys who own the factors of production who get produce either the import or the export good. And this lobby group, I, is going to have preferences that we'll call VI, and minus the contribution that they're giving to the government, CI. So what is this WI, the welfare of this lobby I? Well, there might be some labor income, that's LI. There's going to be profits, to be sure. And since these are individuals in the economy, they're also getting some share of the tariff revenue and the consumer surplus. So LI, joint labor income for sector I, and alpha I is a fraction of the population that owns specific factor I. Okay? So we're going to see how this lobby interacts with the government. Okay, so we're going to assume this lobby group I presents the government of country I with a contribution schedule. So what does that mean? It means that the lobby group says, look, if you impose tariffs, say 10% on rice, we'll make a nice donation to your next campaign. A donation of, I don't know, 100K, something like that. Or if you impose a tariff on rice, say 5%, then we're going to make a donation that's probably smaller because 5% is smaller than 10%. So this lobby group presents the government with a schedule, which is what are the payouts that can be expected given some trade policy. And these contributions are going to depend critically on the tariff. So it's a function that they're presenting. So tau is going to be the tariff vector set by the home country government, and tau star is the tariff vector set by the foreign country government. And I have up to n goods here, but ignore that. We're going to just do 2 goods. In a 2-good world. So the contribution schedule set by the home lobby is CI, and the contribution schedule for the foreign lobby is CI star. Okay. Any questions?
So,
Yes.
are we still trading the 2 goods at the beginning?
Yes. Same 2 goods.
Okay.
So, as I said, you see n goods here. Forget the n, it's just 2. All right, so here are the lobby group's preferences. Again, now we're making the contributions explicitly a function of the tariffs. And we're trying to figure out, well, what would they contribute? What is this contribution schedule? So, never mind, this is an assumption to make math easy. And also this is just plugging things in, so I would ignore that now. Okay, let's go to this. So the government now has this payoff. For every lobby group that's making contributions, the government takes into account those contributions. So they're summing up all the contributions from all the lobby groups. But in addition, the government cares about welfare, the same things that we talked about before. Consumer surplus, producer surplus, tariff revenue, right? So this is now the government's objective function. In addition to welfare, in some way A, there's also payoff for contributions.
Sorry.
Yes.
Why is that? I mean, why is not the summation, as you are talking about the government payouts association with the lobby? Why the welfare they doesn't depend on the welfare of those lobbies that you
Good.
talk about?
Very good. So this is W tilde, right? This is WI tilde,
Exactly.
the lobby group I.
Yes.
So the W tilde was assumed is that that's the sum of all values.
Okay.
Right? So this is everyone's welfare. And we're going to see how this contribution schedule essentially distorts incentives in favor of the lobby group that's making the contribution.
All right. So, that was my next question after you explained that. Like, okay, the CI is the contribution of the lobby take advantage from other contribution.
So this is the contribution from lobby group I.
Yes. So
Right.
it's all the summation. I mean, it's all the contribution of all the lobby that you are going to have.
Exactly.
So what about the others, like, I don't know, population? I mean, as you are taking the welfare here on the population,
Yes.
not only on the lobby.
Yes.
So why are you not taking also in account the contribution of others that are different from the lobby.
So that's taken into account here. This W. Oh, so I think I know what you're. So the thing to note is that this is I and L. L is a set of industries that lobby. Not all industries lobby.
Okay.
Okay, so this is contributions from industries that lobby, and this is welfare for everybody else. Welfare is exactly as we had it before: consumer surplus, producer surplus, tariff revenue. And now this government, we're assuming, puts some weight on welfare. And of course, the weight on welfare has to determine to some extent what tariffs are selected in equilibrium. Okay? So this government is choosing, is sort of trading off, saying, okay, I know these tariffs are not good for the economy, but here's a lobby group that wants some higher tariffs. How do I trade that off? Okay, so L, as I said, is a set of industries that are organized to lobby. A is the way government attaches to social welfare, and W is social welfare. This would have probably been useful 5 seconds ago. Okay, so we can plug things in, and you can get out an expression, but you can ignore that for now. All right, so we know that this government is going to try to set tariffs. Right? Now, instead of just this expression here, the government has the lobby contributions plus A times all this stuff. Right? But in order to figure out tariffs, one thing we need to know is how world prices are determined, because tariffs affect world prices. So, as before, imports is the difference between what's demanded and what's supplied domestically at a world price. And then we also have net imports of goods out of a foreign country. And so world prices at home is just the difference between tariff, the prices at home, the difference between the tariff and the world price. Prices in the foreign country, the difference between foreign tariffs and world prices. So world markets clear when the import demands are zero, right? So of course one is going to be import demand, one is going to be export supply, and this gives us domestic world prices. World prices. World prices here. Okay. So now we want to think about this game between these two countries. So one country is thinking about its own domestic lobby and its own welfare, and the other country is doing the same thing, setting its own tariffs. So now both these countries have to think, well, how do I want to set my tariffs given what the other country might do in response? So we've got a home government, we've got a foreign government, we've got N lobby groups at home, N lobby groups in the foreign country, potentially, or to simplify N to 2. And now the actions of each government is going to be to set their own tariffs, that's for home, and then for foreign. But then there's also the lobbies that play in this game, right? And these lobbies are setting contribution schedules for home and for foreign. So as you can see, this is like a massive game. Yes, question?
So the lobby groups, they have to be producers, right? They cannot be consumers.
That's right. So so not that they have to be, but the assumption is that only the producers are lobbying in this model. Now, one might say, is that a fair assumption? Certainly in countries like the United States, there are consumer advocacy groups, etc. What you want to ask yourself is the influence of these groups significant enough to overcome the influence of the producer lobby groups? And the answer is typically no. Right? The producer lobby groups have much more resources at their disposal, and they're much more influential in trade policy. So this is a fair assumption. Does that answer your question? Yes.
This is as a follow-up. How does How constrained is the contribution schedule?
How constrained is the contribution schedule?
Is it disciplined at all by the
So-
essentially the product?
So what we're going to assume for now is that it's differentiable, and that's how we need it.
So, I guess what I'm really trying to ask is, can the contribution schedule be rationalized through the producer surplus? I mean, for instance, mechanically it should be bounded by the size of the producer surplus, for instance. Are there more restrictions that the theory has been able to implement?
Let me answer that in 2 seconds, 2 slides.
Okay.
Okay? Because we're going to be deriving properties of the contribution schedule that will come from the profits of the lobby. But what you'll see is that we don't need an explicit form for the contribution schedule. Okay. And so the only thing we're assuming for now is that these schedules are differentiable. Okay, so we're going to assume the lobbies in each country move first. So they set the contribution schedules. They're going to act simultaneously and non-cooperatively. So each take is given the contributions of the other. Then the government set trade policies, given the contribution schedules, and they also act simultaneously and non-cooperative. So we're going to solve this game by backward induction. So first, the government set trade. First thing about the government setting trade policy, taking as given the contribution schedules, and then thinking about the lobbies setting the contribution schedules. So as I was mentioning to you, what's your name?
Condo.
What is it?
Condo.
Condo. These contribution schedules could, in principle, be very complicated, right? They could be discrete, they could be like in some weird spaces, but we're going to assume, the only thing we're going to assume is that they're differentiable. And it turns out that using this theory of common agency by Bernheim and Winston in 1986, we don't need to assume much more than that. And we're not going to have to sit here